Hello, welcome to our workshop today on backyard wildlife habitats. My name is Rachel. I'm going to be your instructor today. I'm going to take you on a short tour of our property, which is a certified wildlife habitat. It's also our home where we're raising our children and where we grow a lot of our own food. I'm going to walk you through the process of a wildlife habitat through the lens of the National Wildlife Federation. If you'd like to check the site out for yourself online, it's www.nwf.org. It's a 5-step process. They cover the 5 elements that you'll need to address on your property to make sure that you have a wildlife habitat that meets the needs of the wildlife in your area. Those 5 areas include food, water, cover, sustainable practices, and places to raise young. The first I'm going to address is food, so let's go take a look. Okay, so we're going to talk about food sources for the wildlife in your area. With the Certified Wildlife Habitat Program from the National Wildlife Federation, they ask that you address food sources in at least 3 different ways. Some of the ways that you can address food sources would be plants with seeds. You could address it with nectar. You could address it with foliage, twigs. You could also do suet if you don't have enough room to do plants. You could do bird feeders, hummingbird feeders, so forth. However, the preferred approach is that you're actually using plants, seeds, berries, fruits, that sort of thing. So what we have here, this is our pollinator garden. We grow a lot of plants here specifically for pollinators. There's echinacea, you might know it as purple coneflower. There's rudbeckia, you might know it as black-eyed Susan. There's a lot of milkweed in there actually. And there's some other things in here too, like foxglove. The bumblebees love foxglove. I'm going to show you the echinacea seed head. I actually leave the seed head standing all fall, all winter, and even into spring. And I only gradually clear it out in early spring. That way the birds have plenty of forage and the bees have habitat as well. So I want to show you. This is a well-eaten seed head. This is from echinacea. So here's an example of something that I grow specifically for the wildlife as well. It's not what you would typically think of when you think of forage, but it is something that I find the birds really do pick from during the winter, and this is an heirloom sorghum. So think corn, but taller, and it gets this ornamental broom thing on top. The birds come in and they sit here on our cattle panel archways, and they pick at the seed heads all winter long. You can see they've been eating, and I'm actually going to be taking these down now that we're well into spring and they're finding other food. Yeah, this is broomcorn sorghum. And this is a seed head from rudbeckia. As I said, you might know that as black-eyed Susan. And again, I grow these largely for the birds, and you can see they do come through and pick out the seeds during the fall and the winter. And this is forage for them. So we've talked about 3 different kinds of seed sources that come from plants that we grow. I'm going to take you on to a different type of food source. So the next type of food source that we're going to talk about is berries and fruits. And again, these are things that you would grow on your property with the intent of either feeding the wildlife exclusively or at least sharing with them. So what we have here is a native red twig dogwood, and you can see it's gone through flowering and now it's starting to form its berries. We also have nearby some winterberry hollies, And these plants together are strictly for the wildlife. They're not for us other than just to look pretty. I'm going to take you over to one other thing that we grow strictly for the wildlife in just a second. And so this is the native dogwood tree, and you can see its flowering is complete and it's beginning to form berries as well. This is something we grow largely for the wildlife, and it has some ornamental value for us. But yes, so this is another example of berries as a food source. So here's another source of berries or fruit for wildlife, and while it's not one that we would want to grow exclusively for the wildlife, we do share it. And I'll tell you something, I love raspberries, and our youngest daughter, she loves raspberries too. So if the birds were taking unfairly, we wouldn't take that very long, but I can tell you that they actually don't take that much. And I look at it this way. I rely on the birds out here to do the vast majority of our pest control, and I don't expect them to work for free. So I let them have the red raspberries. They don't take too much. So here's another one that produces berries. We do share with the wildlife, and I can tell you the birds do enjoy it. These are pine berries and strawberries. And I've only ever tried to exclude the birds once in all the years of us growing strawberries here. And I found that I actually needed to let them in, because what happened when I excluded them was we had more slugs. And slugs like strawberries too, and they don't share nearly as fairly as birds do. So we share with the birds. And here is the last example I'm going to give you for fruit or berry food sources. This one is a gummy berry, and the berry becomes plump and red around June, and the fruit is very astringent until it is dead ripe. And you'll know because it puckers your mouth when it is not ripe. And so I actually enjoy sharing this with the birds, because the birds are kind of my barometer of whether the fruit's ripe. The birds will come out when the fruits start to turn red, and they'll sample a little bit. If it's astringent, they won't eat much. When the birds start coming out in numbers, that's when I know the fruit is ready to pick. So this I happily share with the birds. So the next kind of food source for wildlife that we're going to talk about is nectar. Now, we visited this site earlier when I mentioned pollen, but this is also a place for nectar. And when I think of nectar, I think of butterflies and I think of hummingbirds. And I can tell you that both the butterflies and the hummingbirds do frequent our echinacea, the purple coneflower, for nectar. One of the other places that they visit is the milkweed, which is also in this bed. There's another plant that I find that they visit that's not come up yet, so won't be able to show you, unfortunately, but it's cannas. Cannas, the hummingbirds love those. So we've talked about seeds, we've talked about fruits and berries, we've talked about nectar and pollen. Let's see what else we can talk about. So another foliage food source for wildlife is actually red clover. I plant this in a lot of places throughout our main garden. It's a food source for rabbits. And I have found over the years of including this in our garden that the rabbits prefer to eat the red clover, and they leave our vegetables alone. So it's kind of a win-win. The other thing that these red clovers are doing is they're fixing nitrogen in the soil. So they're feeding the garlic that I have planted next to it. They're keeping the soil nice and moist for the worms underneath. So we get some benefits out of this too. But I wanted to show you because it's an excellent forage for rabbits. Let's see if we can find another food source in the foliage section of food. So we're going to talk about pollen. And when we think about pollen as a food source, I want you to think about the availability of pollen throughout the year. So things that would be available early in the year, early spring, and then things that would be available later on in the year in the summer, and then some things yet that would be available in the fall. So what we have here are some plants that are blooming now. This is about the middle of spring. We have a native columbine. We have some non-native wildflowers. We have a native digitalis that's going to be blooming soon. And this provides a pollen food source in the spring for bees, wasps, butterflies. I'm going to take you to a section where we have plants for summer blooming. Let's go take a look. Here we have some summer blooming pollen sources for our wildlife habitat. In here we have the native echinacea, or you might know it as purple coneflower. We also have some daisies, and we have the native Jerusalem artichokes, which are in the sunflower family. So these do bloom in the summer. Right now it's mid-May, so there's not a whole lot going on here other than leafy greens. But come summer, this is going to be a busy place. Lots of bees, lots of butterflies, and hummingbirds too. I have one more spot I want to show you, and it's where we have our fall pollen plants. Let's go take a look. And so here we have our plants for fall pollen to be a food source for the wildlife in the fall. So we have native coreopsis, you might know it as tick seed. We have native goldenrod, and we also have, which you probably can't see in this picture, but we also have the native New England aster. And all of those bloom in the fall and is a hot spot for bees when there's not much else to find. So we've talked a lot about food. We talked about seeds, we talked about fruits and berries, we talked about nectar, we talked about foliage, and we've talked about pollen. That's going to wrap up food for your wildlife habitat. If you don't feel like you can include these kinds of plants where you are, by all means do look to include feeders, but bear in mind that there's a maintenance responsibility that goes along with having feeders. You're going to have to keep them clean. You're going to have to keep them well stocked. Any food that's spoiled is going to need to be discarded, because the worst thing that you can do is to let your feeders get dirty and have spoiled food. It'll make the wildlife very sick. So that's going to wrap up food. We're going to move on to water next. So the next element that you'll need to address in setting up your own backyard wildlife habitat is water. And one of the ways that you can address that is with bird baths. As you see here, you're going to want to keep them clean. You want to make sure it has fresh water in it. And the other thing you want to look out for is, think like a bird. Birds don't like to feel vulnerable or very exposed, especially in a position where they might be vulnerable to predators. So you want to locate your bird bath in a close proximity to a tree, so that if need be, the bird can seek shelter. We have our bird baths fairly close to trees here. And so here's another bird bath of ours. Again, you can see we have it located close to a tree, so if the bird needs to seek shelter, it can, and it's not exposed to predators. And another way that you can address water for your wildlife habitat is by providing butterfly puddlers. And so it's a shallow dish with just a very small amount of water in it. It's not nearly as big as a bird bath, but butterflies, bees, so forth can come visit it and get some water and cool off in the heat of the day if they need to. So far we've talked about ways to provide food for your wildlife habitat. We've also talked about sources of water. Before we move on to cover, I wanted to mention that if you happen to be blessed with a spring or a stream, a pond, river, a lake on your property, that those also count toward the water requirement. Moving on, we're going to talk about cover, and the National Wildlife Federation asks that you provide at least 2 different sources of cover for the wildlife in your area. We're going to talk about mature trees first. So here you'll see the canopy of several of our trees. You'll notice that at full maturity, they're pretty close to each other, and they're pretty good size. There's plenty of room for birds, bats, tree frogs, insects, spiders, you name it. One of the trees in this we've just showed you, we actually call our AWA tree because there's so much life in it. You're probably not going to be starting out with much in the way of mature trees if the property is new to you, but do think long term, what could you plant that would someday become a mature tree canopy for the wildlife? One of the other things that the National Wildlife Federation mentions as a source of cover that you could provide for wildlife is a bramble patch. And if you think about it, it's kind of easy for a bird to get in there, and it's all clustered together. The bird wouldn't be so easily seen by predators. It's not so easy for predators to get in there. With one caveat, I have seen snakes in our bramble patch, so something to think about. I wouldn't say that it's a reason to not have one. We obviously have a bramble patch, and the snakes here are not venomous, so they don't bother us. But when you have a bramble patch, you can expect wildlife. So another source of cover that you could provide for the wildlife on your property is ground cover plants. And I'd like to challenge your thinking on this a little bit. We've talked a lot about birds. Now we're going to talk about toads, frogs, earthworms. The wildlife, a lot of it's in your soil, believe it or not. I'm going to show you what it looks like from the perspective of something small that lives along the ground, so you can see why ground cover plants like these hostas and these wild violets provide such a protective layer for them. So what we have here is we have some really big leaf hostas. We have some native jack-in-the-pulpits here. And then just ahead we have some native ferns, and we have some native wild violets. So most of what's here is native. There's actually, just out of view, there's a native rhododendron as well. Most of what's here is native with the exception of these really big leaf hostas. And you can see that it provides almost a complete cover of the ground. And if you come and take a look down, you can see how much protection that provides. So lots of things could hide under there, toads, frogs, and then like I said, the soil biota as well is well protected from the weather, extreme rain, extreme temperatures, and so forth. So think about this kind of application when you're also looking at ways to provide cover for the wildlife. So another source of cover that you could consider for your wildlife habitat would be a rock pile or rock wall. And this type of cover is important for skinks, salamanders. It's also really important for spiders. Think about your small predators that would be protecting your garden for you and keeping pests at bay. They need places that they can hide, and then a lot of them are kind of ambush hunters. So a rock pile or rock wall provides important habitat for them so that they can provide those services for you. Another source of cover that you could provide in your wildlife habitat would be evergreen trees. Out of all the trees that we have here, I would say that this particular tree, in addition to 1 or 2 other evergreens here, are the most heavily occupied by birds on our property. This is a native red juniper. You might know it as a red cedar. It is technically a juniper, and it does seed pretty freely. So if you decide that this is something you'd like to include on your property because the birds do favor it so much, just bear in mind that you may have to go around removing volunteers from time to time. So here's another type of cover that you could consider. And I just want you to be a little open-minded about this one. So far we've talked about wooded areas, so mature tree canopies. We've talked about a bramble patch. We've talked about a rock pile, ground cover, and evergreens. Now we're going to talk about a brush pile or a pile of logs. What you see behind me is our yard waste compost pile. And it is heavily used by the wildlife here. We have rabbits that burrow underneath of it in cold weather. We have insects that live in it year-round. The birds come and forage from it because a lot of the seeded plants go up here. We also have snakes that come through here, and we even have groundhogs that come and forage from the things that go on this yard waste compost pile. Now, the size of this pile might be larger than what you would have on your property. We have 2.5 acres roughly, so a smaller property probably wouldn't have something quite this size, and that's okay. It'll still be useful to the wildlife in your area. If you think that something like this is a little unsightly, maybe put it where either you don't see it directly or your neighbors don't see it directly. But absolutely do consider this type of resource for the wildlife in your area. So far the elements of wildlife habitat that we've discussed are food, water, cover, and now we're going to talk about places to raise young. And it's no surprise that we're back to mature trees. The National Wildlife Federation mentions mature trees as one of the sources that you can provide to the wildlife in your area for places to raise their young. Now, you might think of just birds laying eggs and nests, and that's one aspect, but there are also insects, there are wasps, there are tree frogs, there are bats, you name it. I'm going to show you one other way that you can provide a place for the wildlife to raise their young on your property. So here we are back at the milkweed, and this is one of those other ways that you can provide a source for the wildlife to raise their young. And milkweed is important to the monarch butterfly because that's where it's going to lay its eggs. The eggs hatch, and the caterpillars come out and feed upon the leaves of the milkweed. There are a few other plants with similar roles, and I'm going to show you. And here we are at the dill again, and dill plays a similar role, but in this case it's for the swallowtail butterfly. It comes and lays its eggs on the dill and a few other plants in the same family. The eggs hatch and the caterpillars feed upon those plants. You probably know them as parsley worms. So we grow a lot of dill here, and we share it. We share it with the swallowtail butterflies and their young. I'm going to show you a couple more plants. Let's take a look. And here we are at the carrots again, and again this is for the swallowtail butterfly. It lays its eggs on the leaves, the eggs hatch, and the caterpillars feed upon the leaves. So just remember that these kind of sources are important to the life cycles of the wildlife in your area. There's one last plant I'm going to show you. So here we have the native pawpaw tree. This one's just a baby. We have several babies on our property. And it is the host plant for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. And it does the same thing as the other butterflies that I mentioned. It lands on the leaves and it lays its eggs. The eggs hatch and then they feed upon the leaves. And like I said, this is a native pawpaw. It does provide fruit for us as well once it reaches maturity. So it's not something that's just for the wildlife, it's for us as well. Okay, so we've talked about food, water, cover, places to raise young, and the final element that the National Wildlife Federation asks you to consider in creating your backyard wildlife habitat is sustainable practices. And they have 3 categories that you can address in sustainable practices. One of the categories is soil and water conservation. And one of the things that you can do in that category is to capture rainwater from your roof and to also use drip irrigation. So what we've done is to combine the two. I want to caution you up front that there are a lot of ways that you can do rain barrels wrong. Think about the size of your roof, think about the amount of square feet, and think about the kind of rainstorms that you get in your area. For us, the amount of rain that comes off the roof would flood a rain barrel easily if it was just an isolated piece by itself. So what we've done is we've tied it to a drip irrigation line. It's gravity fed and the line's always open, so as the water comes off the roof, it goes through the pipe and then it slowly waters our ornamentals that are planted around the house. I would not advise using this type of water for watering your edibles. There could be things leaching from your roof, but it's perfectly fine for ornamentals. Another thing that you can do in the category of soil and water conservation is to use mulch. And I want to show you the importance of using mulch in your garden and around your property. And I want to challenge your thinking about what mulch is also. Here we have some shredded wood chips. These are actually donated to us by a neighbor who had some aging trees cut down. It also includes dry leaves. Some of our friends brought us bag leaves over the past couple of years, and we've used that for mulch as well. I want to show you what it looks like down here. You scoot this away, look at that. It breaks down and you get this gorgeous, dark, humusy soil form. And usually when I do this, you can see worms start to come out. It is one of the best habitats for soil life, and the plants love it. It conserves moisture, it adds nutrients as it breaks down, it moderates the temperature. Lots and lots of good things happen when you use mulch. I'm going to show you one other way of using mulch in the garden. So another form of mulch that you could use in your garden is what I like to call chop and drop. You take something that you grow, like in this case, red clover, and you just chop it and drop it. And I come in by hand and just pull it and lay it down, and you'll see that there was actually a layer here where I did this about a week ago around our potatoes. And the nice thing about clover, when you use that as a chop and drop mulch, is that clover is naturally a nitrogen fixing plant. It fixes nitrogen on its roots by a relationship that it has with a certain bacteria in the soil. And so that bacteria attaches itself to the roots and the nitrogen forms there. When you chop the red clover, it sheds some of those roots. And as it sheds those roots, it releases that nitrogen into the soil to become available to the plants around it, in this case, potatoes. So chop and drop mulch is a really, really beautiful thing, and I would highly encourage you to use it. So another thing in the category of soil and water conservation is reducing erosion. And what you see here is something we've done to reduce erosion on our property, and it is a little swale. So what it does is it captures rainwater that comes in at a point of excess, and then typically would just sheet across our lawn because our property is on a slope, but instead it goes into this swale and then it soaks in slowly and becomes available to the plants that are planted in that berm that you see. We have some pine berries, we have blueberry, we have jostaberry, we have a native aronia, and they get to really reach their roots deep into where that water soaks into that swale. I'm going to show you one other example of a swale. So here's another swale that we have, and on the back part of it you'll see there's some sea berries planted, and they are nitrogen fixers. They do produce berries. They're edible to humans. They're actually called the citrus of the north. You might know it by the name sea buckthorn. So they're planted on the berm, and then down here is where the swale is, and that swale acts as a divider between the sea berries and the garden bed. And you can see just part of the garden bed here. I've got some climbing nasturtiums up these teepees here. It's going to have tomatoes shortly. But this swale, again, for us, it's stopping that sheeting effect that we get with those big storms, because this garden really is on a slope. So the water comes in, and many times this swale fills right up to the top, and then it drains slowly, and everything around it, everything in this bed and the sea berries as well, get to benefit from that extra water. So the next category under sustainable practices is removing non-native plants and animals. Now, what I will tell you is to please use good, careful judgment in applying this to your property. I would say it's not a 100% all or nothing rule. If you have some, you probably know it as invasive, I would say really adventurous, non-native plants that are out competing some of the other things that you really ought to be growing and have a higher wildlife value, then certainly do carefully remove those. But if they are locally adapted, if they're providing services to the wildlife, if they're providing services to you, and they're not out competing other things, then perhaps there is a place for them. If you take a look at the University of Delaware's Cooperative Extension website, and you look under the Sustainable Landscape page, you'll see what I'm talking about. They give you some guidelines about when to remove something and when not to remove something. And let's face it, we all have ornamentals, right? We all have our tomatoes, right? So those are non-natives. So think carefully, before you just say, well, if it's not native, then it doesn't fit here. It just might. However, if you're going to be removing non-native plants, then naturally you'd want to replace them with something perhaps native. I'm going to give you some examples of native plants. Each example that I'm going to give you is something that is either edible or medicinal. So it's not just a matter of providing for the wildlife, although it does that. It's also about providing for you as well. This here is the American elderberry. You can see it's just starting to form the flower heads. We're in the middle of May here. It will have berries early summer. Here's another example of a native plant. This is a young American witch hazel. Witch hazels going to get a bit bigger than this. This one's only about 3 or 4 years old. And you probably think witch hazel, the skin astringent. It's not something you would take internally, but do take a look at this. This is a useful plant to have around, and as I said, it is native. It's the Virginiana species. And here we are back to pawpaws, and as I said earlier, they are native. We are in Delaware. Pawpaws have a native range of kind of the eastern seaboard over to what I remember from school as Mimel, right? The man in the middle of the country. So that's kind of the native range of pawpaws. And like I said, they're a host plant for the zebra swallowtail butterfly, but they're also a food source for humans. I'm going to take you to another native plant. Let's take a look. And here's another native plant. This is the native goldenrod. This is about mid-spring, so we're nowhere near flowering yet. But come late summer, early fall, this is a really beautiful plant. It attracts a lot of pollinators, and it does have medicinal properties for humans as well. I would encourage you to take a look. I personally use it myself. But yeah, this is goldenrod. And here's one final native plant for you to consider. This is aronia. It does produce edible berries. The berries are considered a superfruit and very dark purple and very nutritious. They're also not entirely tasty. So you might want to think carefully before planting this one if it's something that you think you might want to eat. The birds love it. We're going to be using it in juices and jams and jellies and things like that, not really eating out of hand. It is a beautiful plant in the fall. The leaves turn a bright fire engine red. So this is another native to consider. It's aronia. So under the category of controlling exotic species or removing non-native plants and animals, this is still a category under sustainable practices. One of the things that the National Wildlife Federation mentions is reducing lawn. And you can see here, this is about an acre. This is our front acre. And we've done a lot in the past several years to reduce the lawn. Now, the reason that the National Wildlife Federation mentions this in trying to create a wildlife habitat is that lawn is, in most cases, not native. It creates a dependence on fossil fuels for maintaining a manicured look. And for many people, it also creates a dependence on chemicals to keep it looking nice and green and lush and what they would call weed-free. And so all of these things contribute to air pollution, water pollution. They are toxic to amphibians particularly, also herbivores. And so rather than have that kind of scenario where not only are there toxins, but there are also plants that are not providing much use to the wildlife, they would rather that you reduce your lawn and put in other plants instead. And of course they favor natives, but we have a mix of natives and non-natives here. The key is really just to avoid those opportunistic exotics, the ones that will take over. But you can see what we've done. Like I said, this is an acre. A lot of people are going to be working with a smaller footprint. Don't feel like you need to do something this big. A smaller scale will still give the wildlife in your area the benefit that they need. So the last category in the sustainable practices section for the certified wildlife habitat is organic practices. And the way that the National Wildlife Federation presents this is they give you essentially two things that you can work with. One is an expectation that you eliminate synthetic fertilizers, synthetic pesticides. The other is an expectation that you also compost. So what I would share with you is that those two things, though they may seem separate, they actually go together. And what I'm going to show you, this is one of our compost piles. We generally have 3 or 4 going at a time. And this one includes not only some of our kitchen wastes, but it also includes things like shredded paper, cardboard, and it includes some aged horse manure that I had gotten from a friend's biodynamic farm. So this is a very mixed compost pile. Your compost pile does not have to include manure. You can do it strictly with kitchen scraps and shredded paper and cardboard. We have a pile like that too. The key is to make sure it's balanced, your carbon and your nitrogen. And here's what I'm going to show you. This You see how crumbly this is? And it's loose. This isn't slimy, this isn't sludgy, okay? You should be able to smell it, and it smells earthy, almost a little sweet, okay? It smells like soil. If you've got something that smells funky, that smells sour, that's not compost. You've just rotted some things. Now, if you get to that point, you can fix it. It needs air, it needs carbon. I'm going to give you a couple resources for good composting. Dr. Elaine Ingham, she has probably the best information on composting, and she really gets into the soil biology of it. Look her up. She's got a lot of free resources online on her webpage and on YouTube. Another good resource for composting is Jeff Lawton with the Permaculture Research Institute. He's based out of Australia. He gives you very practical step-by-step how to compost. Both are excellent resources. Now, I mentioned that this is really the solution to getting away from synthetics, and the reason is because compost is a low-dose organic fertilizer. It will release fertility slowly into your soil. But more importantly, it's an inoculant. It's an inoculant of beneficial microorganisms. And those beneficial soil microorganisms are the real backbone of everything that you're going to be growing. They're going to keep soil diseases at bay. They're going to make sure that your plant is growing at a healthy, steady rate. And when you have those things in your corner, you don't need pesticides, you don't need herbicides. You can apply this as a side dress in your garden, and it will act as like a top layer of mulch while it's releasing nutrients and while it's inoculating your soil. So good compost will do all of those things for you. I can tell you, of all the things we grow here, I don't use any synthetic fertilizers. I don't use any pesticides of any kind, not even the organic ones. I don't use any herbicides. I don't use any fungicides, none of it. It comes down to soil health. So we've talked a lot about food. We've talked about water. We've talked about cover. We've talked about places to raise young, and we've also talked about sustainable practices. Those are the 5 elements that you'll need to address in creating your own backyard wildlife habitat. If you'd like more information, or if you'd like details on how to get certified, take a look at the National Wildlife Federation's website. It's www.nwf.org. Good luck.